as much as I would love to just listen to Aretha, I was really jamming out there for a moment. I'll pass it to Sharita.
Absolutely, absolutely. It is so good to be here in community with you all tonight. I'm grateful to see your faces, and if the faces I can't see, I see your names, and I feel your energy. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Um, my name is Sharita Love. I'm with the Education Equity Center of St. Louis. I am honored to be joined by David, Karishma, and Brashan with the Through Ferguson team. And then we also have co-leading with us tonight, the collective STL. I know that Alonzo is in the room. I think I saw your face. I'm trying to scan the room right now. And then Dr. Terry Harris will be joining us as well later. We are thrilled to set aside time and space for us and to journey a bit through both some information and data sharing, which Through Ferguson will lead us through, some processing and an invitation of your voice to add to this conversation. And then to close out, focusing on what is needed and necessary for us, is this notion of exhaling and healing and connecting and committing to this continued work. So with that introduction and welcome, and just thanking you for journeying through whatever you had to today to bring you into this space and time with us, I'm going to pass it to Through Ferguson to get started. I'm not sure, David, if you're going to kick us off, but passing it to you all.
Thank you. So I'm going to get this wonderful slide deck together that we have for you all. Right view. Okay. Everybody can see that?
All
Awesome.
good.
So we're really, really excited to be with you all, to have this space specifically for Black educators, and also to especially have this space to breathe a little bit, right? To be in community with each other, to dig into some of these issues that we know we all face every day, day in, day out, but to also have some time to heal and to do some restorative practices. So first up, we just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the still separate, still unequal, and state of education reform, research, community, storytelling, and other work that we've done before we dive into some of the discussion pieces of it. So first off, we at Through Ferguson just think it's really so important that we lead with our stories. And lead with our experiences and valuing relationships in this equity work. And so we want to tell you a little bit about ourselves. So I'm going to pass it to Karishma up first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Karishma Furtado. I'm the lead data and research catalyst at Through Ferguson, and it was my privilege to get to lead the research components of Still Separate, Still Unequal and State of St. Louis, State of Education Reform projects that we'll be sharing with you this evening. I came into Through Ferguson as founding staff alongside David and Nicole Hudson. Seeing them, and so when the opportunity to apply that learning to up. I jumped at it and have not really looked back since. The area of education equity is particularly meaningful and important to me. It's a chance to study this as well as through my looking at the intersection of race, racism, and health within schools has really been tremendous. I'm so glad to be with you this evening and looking forward to the conversation that we're going.
I'll go next. Hey everybody, David Dwight. I'm the Executive Director and Lead Strategy Catalyst at Forward Through Ferguson. I joined at the same time as Karishma, and we both worked for the Ferguson Commission before that and had the immense privilege of getting to meet thousands of St. Louisans across the region. And education equity consistently was something that was brought up and was on the top of mind for so many families, the youth that we engaged across the region. And for me, I've been in St. Louis for a decade now. But when I really think about education, I think about it through the lens of both sides of my family. On my mom's side of the family, before my mom was the first to have access to a higher education degree, the women, especially on that side of the family, didn't make it past third grade education because of a variety of other social conditions that didn't present those opportunities to them, as hardworking and incredible as they are. And then my dad's side of the family that had more access to educational opportunities, but really had to fight for it and faced a lot of backlash in Jacksonville, Florida, where a lot of people did not like the idea of Black people having access to those opportunities. And so it's kind of through that lens that I'm so honored to be part of the work in St. Louis. And I'll pass it to Bree.
Thank you, David. I am Vershawn Hamilton. I'm the Senior Youth at the Center Policy and Advocacy Fellow. And I like to say I am first a concerned aunt of Black school-age youth who understands that the education system is just one of many systems that's designed to devalue and oppress my babies and our babies. And so to this work, I bring this heart of an aunt as well as an advocate who's studied social policy and poverty, and is really committed to just advancing racially equitable solutions and policies so that we can ultimately transform these oppressive systems, especially education, into a space where our youth can truly thrive. So glad to be here and join in the conversation today. Thank you.
So with that, we want to hear a little bit about you. So Bree's gonna drop a link in the chat, just a sign-in opportunity. We really don't want this to be the end of a conversation. You know, we want this to be the beginning of a long-term relationship as we do this work together. So please just take a little bit of time to fill that out so that we can stay in contact with you. And as you notice things, as we notice things and opportunities, we can work together to do this work. So really quickly, a little bit about our whys Forward Through Ferguson. So as you may know, our work began after the killing of Michael Brown Jr. and the uprising that launched the creation of the Ferguson Commission, where these volunteer community members raised their hand to listen to community members, to confront the pain, the outrage, the tensions that had simmered for too long, and to really look at what were the underlying root causes, not just the symptoms of the racial inequity that we see across our region. And so those 3,000 community members that were engaged over 70 public meetings, put in over 30,000 hours of their heart, their soul, their vision, to create calls to action for how we could move our region forward towards racial equity. And they really just found through the process that for decades, our systems have been siloed and racial equity was falling through the cracks. And so here were policy calls to action for how we could make sure that we were fixing those cracks and centering the youth of our region as well. And so our mission is born out of the commission. out of that vocal community desire, that momentum that was amassed during the uprising couldn't just end there, that we needed ongoing infrastructure to help move this into policy and ensure that report didn't gather dust on our shelf. And so we work on our mission through 3 action strategies: advocating for policy and systems change, those calls to action from the report, building racial equity capacity, and also sustaining the work, investing in the people power, and the financial capital that it'll take to do this work. And we believe if we can align ourselves around these goals, that this equitable future of 2039, a generation after the killing of Michael Brown, that we can achieve racial equity. And that means some urgent things and conditions that we need to change today if we're going to set a future so that a baby born in 2039 has access to all the opportunities in St. Louis that they should be assured. And so in the process of doing this work, we always love to pair our data work with community storytelling and experiences. And so I'm sure some of you may know Erica Williams, but here's her family. And we asked a number of families what education equity would look and feel like to them if it was achieved in St. Louis. And she said, the districts with the most high needs students would receive equal to or more funding, and funding would not be predicted or predicated upon property taxes within that district. Our children receive all of the necessary services pursuant to their IEPs, and they would have access to high quality educational materials and opportunities. It's so important because educational equity is racial equity. So we just wanted to lift up some community resident parent voices. So I'm going to pass it to Bree to talk a little bit more about Still Separate, Still Unequal and the tool.
Thank you, David. So the Still Separate, Still Unequal tool is one way we live into our charge of demystifying the policies and practices that hold back Black and Brown St. Louisans while benefiting white ones. We've worked in the education space for several years now because, like the commission, we believe in the power of education. As a society, we have a bone deep certainty that, paired with hard work, education is perhaps the best guarantee of lifelong well-being, prosperity, and success. It's also essential for thriving societies. That's why Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote in the court's 1954 Brown v. Board opinion that today, education is perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. At the heart of that text is recognition that education is integral to the foundation of democracy and the American dream. But in so many ways, the opportunity of education is unevenly distributed. The achievement gap, the learning gap, the discipline gaps are evidence of that. Our education landscape is littered with this evidence of how Black students tend to perform worse than their white classmates. Countless reports have plumbed the depths of these gaps, many observing the slow or even backwards progress being made to close them. These cracks are so deep and persistent that they've become, for many, permanent disfigurations in our education landscape, despite many efforts to close them. We assert that those past efforts largely failed because they didn't engage with the sources of the outcome disparities, that being the structure of our education system. We further assert that our education system is doing exactly what it was built to do: afford better opportunities to white wealthy students at the expense of poor Black students. When we asked, why is it important to work for education equity, Amanda Cologne Smith's response echoes what many St. Louis families believed, which is that our schools are a critical part of our social fabric, telling us so much about how we truly value each other. What we prepare and provide for our children is a sacred work in building our future. So if we agree that schools are an essential community investment for our kids and that in the health of our region, and that our efforts for the last few decades have benefited some families but failed to shift outcomes for generations of kids, then we need to dive into the root causes of St. Louis's racial inequities. The Still Separate, Still Unequal tool intentionally shifts attention upstream, away from the glaring outcome disparities and towards some of those structural barriers that make those disparities nearly inevitable. This tool is organized into investigations of 4 interrelated structural barriers to racial equity in our education system, those being education environment, funding, property taxes, segregation, housing, and development policies. Now, it's not a comprehensive rundown of all the structural barriers in our education system or intended to be a definitive explanation of the causal linkages between each barrier, but it's a start. And it's a call for us to see the system that produces the outcomes we are all too familiar with. And now I will pass it to Karishma. Thank you.
Thanks, Bree. So how did we go about delivering on those aims that Bree just mentioned? First, let's ground ourselves in some basics of the St. Louis region's educational landscape, which I'm sure you're all likely deeply familiar with as teachers and educators. The Tri-County education system is exceptionally fragmented given the size of its population compared to similar cities like Chicago and Baltimore. The roughly 310,000 school-aged students in St. Louis City, St. Louis County, and St. Charles County are split across 29 public school districts, 180 private schools, and 17 charter networks. Because of capacity limitations, we made a couple of important decisions about the scope of this tool. First, we decided to limit our focus to Missouri and to exclude the Metro East because of the complexity that would be introduced by another state's laws, policies, and histories, which we really tried to delve into as explainers of what we were seeing here. Second, we didn't examine the special school district because of its unique structure and the desire to avoid making apples to oranges comparisons. But we do feel that's an important area to explore in future work and in future spaces. Third, we limited our focus on the traditional public school system, and we did this for a couple of reasons. As mentioned earlier, our education landscape is incredibly fragmented. So we knew we had to focus our scope if we wanted to be able to do a thorough and systematic investigation. The vast majority, about 2/3 of kids in St. Louis, go to traditional public schools, which made it an obvious place to focus our attention, especially since systematic data is much harder to come by for charter and private institutions. But most importantly, as we noted, the core aim of this project was to examine root causes. Charter schools have only been prevalent in St. Louis for about 15 years. And the systemic inequities that we cover in this report have existed for 60 years and more, generations and generations. So in a very real way, the charter public debate that tends to occupy us is a symptom of what we're trying to understand and not the root of it itself. So with that, what did we find? In short, at every step in the path upstream, we found systemic barriers to education equity. And over the course of the next few slides, I'll share with you just some of the top level findings from the tool. Starting with the structural barrier that's most proximal to outcome disparities, the education environment. So why might we see entrenched racial differences in academic performance? One likely contributor is that the education environment in majority Black districts tends to be different than that in majority white districts. We looked at indicators of education environment quality in 4 categories: staffing levels, staff compensation, staff qualifications, and course offerings. And in most ways, majority Black school districts performed worse on these indicators. We share a selection of them on this slide. For example, teachers in majority Black districts were paid over $6,000 less on average and were 4.7 times more likely to be in their first year of teaching, which matters not because first-year teachers don't try as hard or don't care as much, but because that first year is incredibly stressful. We see the highest rates of churn in that first year, and that departure of a teacher in a student's first year is really disruptive to their education. These differences in staff compensation and qualification contribute in turn to course offering differences. Majority white school districts were 3 times more likely to offer advanced placement classes. 43% of majority Black districts, on the other hand, didn't offer calculus, which is a class not a single majority white district failed to offer. So why are education environments different in majority Black versus majority white districts? Partly because majority white districts are more likely to have the funding to pay for environments rich in opportunity. We found that the St. Louis region's education funding landscape is highly uneven, and it's not an accident. So theoretically, state funding, which is allocated through the foundation formula, should make up for local funding differences. In this section of the tool, we delve into the makeup of the foundation formula and how it systematically falls short of filling funding shortfalls, and thanks to features like hold harmless provisions, actually disproportionately benefits small and or property wealthy school districts. Partly as a result, on average, majority white districts received more funding per student than majority Black districts, about $1,700 more per student. The highest spending school districts spent about $8,400 more per student across all categories of expenditures. Wealthy white districts also got a lot more of their funding from local sources. So overall, funding for education varies widely across the Tri-County region, despite a state funding model that's intended to even things out. That variability is driven by funding variations at the local level. So let's look there next. The fact of the matter is that directly funding education through property taxes is inequitable. The property in majority white districts is vastly more valuable than in majority Black districts. The median assessed property value for majority Black districts is about $98,000 per student. For majority white districts, it's almost 2 times higher at $182,000 or so per student. That difference becomes even more egregious when we look at the ends of the spectrum. The majority white school district with the greatest property wealth was Clayton, has about $428,000 of property wealth per student, compared to the majority Black school district with the greatest property wealth, which is U City, with $255,000 per student. That greater property wealth in majority white districts is driven primarily by both residential and commercial properties that are worth more. And it means that wealthy white districts can raise enough money without taxing themselves as much as property poorer districts. As you likely know, to raise the maximum property tax that they can levy, or the tax rate ceiling, above a certain point, districts need voter approval. We found that majority Black districts tend to have higher tax ceilings, meaning their residents voted to tax themselves more heavily, despite having on average about half the income as majority white districts. And that's what we see in this scatter plot here, this negative relationship. As household wealth or income goes up, tax rates tend to go down. So perhaps at this point, you're reflecting on why valuable property is where it is and what was there before it, and why there are so many fewer such properties in majority Black districts. Let's make our last stop upstream, segregation. What led to these patterns of concentrated wealth and whiteness and vice versa? In some ways, the answer is as simple as this. Historical federal, state, and local policies made it exceedingly difficult for Black families to obtain property, and when they did, if that property became too valuable, local forces used their authority and power to take it. From the FHA program that built the white American middle class to the interstate system as a tool for separating Black neighborhoods from white neighborhoods, to land development initiatives that paved around or right over Black neighborhoods, our history is rich with overtly racist policies that preferentially enriched white individuals and families. The race-neutral policies that went on to replace those overtly racist policies did little to correct for the segregation that had by then taken root. Schools have been part and parcel of these dynamics. For the most part, our schools have grown more segregated over the past 30 years. The graph here shows dissimilarity index, or DI scores, for the region based on public school districts. DI scores are a measure of segregation. They tell us what percent of, in this case, Black or white students would have to move for school districts to reflect the racial diversity in the underlying student population. What we see here is that in 2019, the Tri-County Dissimilarity Index score was 0.71. By comparison, in 1968, soon after Brown v. Board ruled segregated schools unconstitutional, but before most districts had moved to integrate, the dissimilarity index nationwide was 0.8. So today, our region's schools are almost as segregated as the nation's schools were before meaningful integration took place. So this was a very quick look at some of our findings. We hope you'll check out the full tool. We'll drop the link in the chat. But I hope after just that quick trip upstream three things are clear. One, at every step in our journey, we found systemic barriers to education equity. Two, those barriers aren't an accident, they're by design. And three, those barriers in our education system make the outcome disparities nearly inevitable. And understanding that, understanding the deep brokenness of our system is the first step to intentionally changing it. So let me hand it over to Bree to talk more about what that change looks like.
Thank you. So I want to talk about what needs to change in light of these findings. And so one of our favorite sayings is that diagnosis determines treatment. When we look at education disparities and make a diagnosis about individual failure of Black kids that aren't trying hard enough, or of parents that don't care, then we develop one set of treatments. Treatments that try to increase engagement or try to identify those kids with our exceptional potential or grit. However, when we make a diagnosis of system drivers that stack the deck against marginalized students, then we come up with a whole different set of interventions. When we think about interventions that lead to education equity, one of the first questions we should ask is, what would education equity look and feel like? Again, we believe this quote from Amanda Cologne Smith captures what many families believe, and that is that all schools could supplement and support children and families according to social and economic needs. Finally, outcomes, particularly graduation rates and acceptance to 2 to 4 year colleges, would not be predicted by race, nor income of the child, nor school district. And so what does it look like to fix the root causes of education inequity so that our region's schools can meet the social and economic needs of their students? Well, on the state level, we're talking about building a statewide coalition to change potential targets like the foundation formula, strengthening the state's weak constitutional commitment to education, shifting property tax models for funding education, and reworking the state's education standards program. On the regional level, the focus should be to grow partnerships across districts and strong future pipelines, build equity-based infrastructures like the education equity indicators, and create an education design and finance task force envisioned by the Ferguson Commission. Achieving those regional goals will require growing an understanding of systems change and racial equity, establishing common definitions and visions for racial equity, and building the power and agency of families on the local level. And through Ferguson, we'll be focusing our attention largely on our local and regional efforts. And David will actually share more about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bree. So we've really, so much of what the Ferguson Commission really pushed us to think about was, yes, we need to be changing things urgently right now, strengthening our teacher pipelines, working to get kids access to the courses, the support that they need, as well as investing in neighborhoods for what they need. And also, the commission said, we've got to start being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to be able to focus on those immediate needs, as well as get ourselves ready for some of these big policy fights that could change the landscape for another generation. And so as we've been thinking about those landscape changes, we've been thinking about how do we lay a solid foundation for the work? How do we get to build the scaffolding for transformation, all the supports that we'll need to do big things? And then how do we do those big things? How do we build and advocate for change? And so we're really working this year, aside from some of our more direct impact work, to also at the same time build some of that scaffolding for those big bet changes that Bree just talked about on the local and state level, that could include things like property taxes, the way we set up our districts. It could include state level targets that could have a big impact for the next generation of kids. And so in this year, we're really focused on growing the racial equity capacity of education stakeholders. We just launched the application for a racial equity roundtable, which is cohort-based, year-long engagement for 2 leaders from a school district, from also education serving organizations, state level agencies or local agencies that focus on education to really do some case studies, learning, relationship building, and then racial equity action planning by the end of the year to do some immediate impact in racial equity work, as well as just connecting and building systems change capacity. Then we're also focusing on setting the scaffolding for transformation work. So we want to set up this education design and finance task force in a way that has directly affected community members at the center and their voices at the center. We want to work to set regional indicators for a quality education, which we've heard from so many educators as well as families doesn't exist as a standard across our region. So then it's hard to hold our institutions accountable to that. To build a base of advocacy of parents, of youth, educators, administrators that are engaged and activated around some of these changes. And then also to offer support to local districts that are in the process of doing systems change work, trying to take a racial equity lens in their work and plan for this to be a sustainable change for the long term. And so with that, we wanted to just pause and see if there's any general questions that people had about what we just presented to you all. Feel free to unmute yourself and we can talk it out.
Hello, my name is Alonzo Nelson. I'm an educator on the in the Illinois side, but as I mentioned in the chat, these are the same things that we're dealing with in districts like East St. Louis versus a district like a Belleville or North Fallon. And so the question is, because I have had experience in St. Louis, I've taught in the St. Louis Public School District and Riverview Gardens. How do we I guess, motivate or change the mindset of the teachers that are in the classroom and how they approach our kids, our Black and brown kids?
I think that's a great question because so much of the conversation tends to get stuck at the leadership level, the policymakers, not understanding that at the end of the day, the experience of children is dictated almost solely by the educators that they are working with. And I think the fact of the matter is that we have to own that we're asking teachers to do an impossible amount of work with not nearly enough resources and then solve for that. So I think the way through to many of the systems changes that we hope to see, that we plan to achieve, involves strengthening pipelines of teachers, providing them with the professional development supports that they need, better compensating them so that they can be whole humans and be a teacher instead of requiring incredible amounts of sacrifice to stay in that profession. So I don't think we get to do make any of the changes that we have without first tackling the problem of education as a profession not being adequately valued.
Yes, I agree. I just wanted to add on. This is an awesome. I'm William Given. This is an awesome conversation I've been listening in on. I'm a teacher in the St. Louis County school district, and me and my students had a discussion today, and it just made me think of it. The first part of it, I asked my students, we're still in virtual. I said, we was talking about our Black History program and everything. And when I asked, what can we do to, basically to, make the world a more equitable place? I think I have this one student, she put it best. She said, well, Mr. Givens, you know how when the students in kindergarten and you're teaching them their ABCs and their numbers? Yeah. She said, well, that's when we need to start teaching them about equitable practices and just name it, And I was like, man, that's very true. We have to, and that goes along the same lines that you guys were kind of already talking about, how we need to just name it first. You know, we can't start to work towards anything till we name it. And I think that's very important that we actually name it and then work towards it. And another point that she brought up, you know, that picture, and I had a discussion last weekend about this too. But you know that picture that's usually, you know, depicted as equitable practices. You know, they're at a baseball stadium, and man, it's so horrible how we tend to um, like put equity in this in just to this picture, and that's all it is. It's just the image, but it's not a live, breathing work. You know, and that's the scary part about this. You know, some people try to just relegate it or just try to put it in just, you know, it's just this image of these three people trying to see the baseball game, but no one focusing on why the fence is even there and what the fence really represents. So it's very interesting. You know, equity is not that image. You got to stop looking at equity as that image. It's a real life work that we have to dedicate our life to and really start looking at education through this equity lens. And so I think it's powerful work, and it can start right now in the grassroots movement with the teachers, you know, because we are the solely responsible for education right now, like we always have been. So yeah, thank you.
Hey, William, thank you for mentioning, just really quickly, this is Terry Harris. Thank you for mentioning that image. And I just want to say this, because I'm going to talk a little bit later. The fact of the matter is, some kids don't want to go to the baseball game, right? Some kids don't need to go to the baseball game. That's not so, you know, that picture is equitable representation if you want to go to the baseball game. What we're really talking about, to your point, William, we're talking about people who are having real life situations. They're trying to eat, they're trying to breathe, they're trying to stay alive. You know, so thank you for calling out that picture. And I also think it's easier for people to look at that picture and deal with that picture because it's a cartoon. Cartoons are not real. It separates us. Let's really put some images up of people, of young people who are really struggling, and other people who are really struggling with these inequitable dedicated issues that we are strategically placed issues that we have in our city. So thank you for sharing that, bro.
The one other like metaphor that comes up that we sometimes talk about for what you said was so much we think about like racial equity as like it's something you sprinkle on like at the end of it, but we want it like in the batter, baked into the cake, not something that just gets like sprinkled on the top of it. And that like switch of that approach is so important if we actually want to get the impact.
Well, I'll say one other thing. I was thinking about, like you all mentioned at the beginning, like, you know, Brown versus the Board of Education. That was like, those people are still alive. Ruby Bridges is 66, you know what I mean? And the reality is, a lot of these teachers, either they grew up in all white schools, you know what I mean, or all black schools. My grandfather's education stopped in the 5th grade. And, you know, from these lenses looking back, we think that's insane. But the reality is there probably wasn't a middle school or a high school for him to go to. So he did have to stop going he couldn't go to school anymore. You know what I mean? And so I left this in the chat, but like that separate but equal is still ingrained in the mindset of the philosophies of all educational or many educational programs before these teachers come into our inner city schools. Like in our group, we talked about Title I, and how title is equated to special ed, which is equated to Black kids, which is equated to poor or poverty, which is equated to dumb or bad. And so title is like this dangerous buzzword. It's like the new N word or the new special ed word, you know what I mean, in education. And they weaponize it towards our Black and brown kids. And it's one of those things where once you're considered special ed or your title, are you need that kind of support, or you're in poverty, you got this life sentence of, being looked down on or having that the lower expectation when it comes to education. And so then we continue this, achievement gap or whatever you want to call it. And honestly, remote teaching has exposed it, right? It exposed it beautifully in the sense that the kids that are thriving are the kids that don't have to share computers, the kids that have internet, the kids that don't have to babysit, you know what I mean? And the list goes on and on and on. And the kids that are struggling are the ones that, have to do all those things, and they dependent on the district to give them a computer, or they have to go to a park like they do over here on our side, go to a park where they have a Wi-Fi